1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 1, Paul wrote to the church at Corinth and he said, "Now concerning spiritual gifts, my brethren, I do not want you to be ignorant." And so what he would do in chapter 12, 13, and 14 is discuss spiritual gifts and teach them things that would help them better understand spiritual gifts. Well, right within the middle of that section of spiritual gifts, we get to 1 Corinthians chapter 13, and we often call it the love chapter, right? And yet still it's about gifts. It's about love, but it's about gifts. And really what you see going on is that Paul is describing the importance of the two going together. As he talks to this congregation about their different spiritual gifts, it appeared as if there was boasting over each other, that one thought they had a better gift than somebody else, and we read about that in chapter 12. But then we get to chapter 13, and we talk about that even though you might have a gift, and he would talk about himself, all the gifts that he had, but if he didn't have love, then it's nothing. It's pointless. That love has to go along with it if it's going to be valuable at all. As a matter of fact, he would go on to even say that all those different miraculous spiritual gifts, things like tongues and prophecy and the miraculous knowledge that many had, he said that those things will cease. They'll vanish away. They weren't meant to last forever. They weren't supposed to be gifts that were here for the duration of this world. They were meant for a time and they served a purpose, but they would one day vanish away. However, the world wouldn't be completely left without gifts. The other things would go along like faith and hope and love. We still have gifts. They're not miraculous gifts, but still gifts nonetheless, the wonderful blessings that God has given us. And yet you get to chapter 13 and verse 13, and it says the greatest of these gifts, the greatest gift that God has ever blessed mankind with is love. Now, the reason for that is in 13 and verse 8, is because love never fails. See, those different miraculous gifts, they were here for a time and for a season, but they were not meant to be here for the entirety of the world. They would one day go away, and as we stand here today, they're gone. We don't have those gifts that they had back then. However, the other gifts, things like hope and faith and love, they still remain. But the truth is this, hope's not going to remain forever. Hope is something that is described as desire with expectation. Now, when I'm in heaven, I'm not going to hope to go to heaven. It's going to cease. When the world ceases and I go to heaven, I no longer hope. Faith, it's a wonderful gift, but it's not an eternal gift. As a matter of fact, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1 describes hope as the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So when I'm living with God in heaven, I'm no longer going to have faith in him because I will see him. And so faith will cease. But love will never cease. Love continues always. Love, as 13 and verse 8 says, it never fails. It'll always be part of God's people. It's here on earth, and in heaven there will still be love. It's the greatest gift God has given man, but it's not only the greatest gift God's given man. As a matter of fact, the Bible also teaches love is the greatest command that God has given to man. Truth is, God's given man lots of commands. And as a matter of fact, the passage we're going to be studying is Matthew chapter 22. So if you want to open there, they're going to be talking about that old law. And really what's going to happen is some Pharisees heard about Jesus speaking to Sadducees and him silencing them, right? They came and they tested Jesus and tried to put Jesus to the test, and he silenced them. So they thought, okay, well, let us have our go at it. And so they would go to Jesus and they would try to stump him as well. Let's go ahead and read the passage, Matthew chapter 22, starting in verse 34. It says, "But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. Then one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him and saying, 'Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?' Jesus said to him, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets.'" And so their concern was primarily with that law of Moses, and that's what they were discussing. But we could really say the same is true even today in the laws that God gives us, and even in the New Testament, that the greatest command God has given is to love. All right, as they look back at the law, and the truth is that there was lots of laws, and they understood that. I mean, there were laws, thou shalt not murder, and thou shalt not bear false witness, and thou shalt have no other gods before me, and all other kinds of commandments given in the old law. But they said, if you had to boil it down to one, if you could say one command is the greatest, what would it be? And they were testing them. So I don't know if the point was that if Jesus picked one, that he would kind of be lessening the others. I don't really know what they were hoping to accomplish, other than Jesus silenced the Sadducees, and we don't think he can silence us. Let's put him to a test. Let's ask him a question that we don't think he can answer, or at least that he can't answer, and us not be able to turn it right back on him. And so Jesus gave him an answer. You want to know what the greatest commandment is? You love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. It's a quote from Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 4. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. Now these things which I command you today shall be in your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your children." And it's that command that God gives them in Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 4 and the following verses. And Jesus says that's it. That's the greatest commandment. Now as we go through our outline, and consequently, I noticed this. You can tell Barbara's out of town, right? Because I made a mistake and she didn't catch me. I didn't give you blanks on your outline, and I apologize for that. But now you have it all typed out for you. So that's the point number one on that outline. You can read it now. It says is to love, or that love is command. All right. So they asked him, what's the greatest command? And Jesus said the command to love. To love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. The second command is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. But understand that love is a command. Now, that's an interesting thing because sometimes we don't really get the right idea of what love is in our society. We think of love as this deep emotional bond that we have with somebody. And I want you to realize that within the Bible, as we read the word love, and primarily, you know this, there's lots of different words that are translated love. The most common one is agape love, and it's the Greek word that most Christians know. It's agape, right? And that's what he's commanding here. And I want you to understand that agape does not mean emotion. It doesn't mean a strong emotional bond with somebody. The truth is this: you are commanded to love everybody. You're commanded to love your neighbor as yourself, and you're commanded to love people. Truth is you walk through Walmart, you might walk by people in the rows that you've never met before, but you're commanded to love that person. It doesn't mean you have a strong emotional bond with them. I'll tell you this, I preached for a number of years. You know this, in Clovis, New Mexico, and I still get emails every day from Steed Todd obituary, or Steed Todd Funeral Home. They send me their obituary. And so every time someone dies and the funeral goes through them, I get an email. And I tell you, majority of the time, it's people I don't know. I look to say, is there anyone I know? And I click on it, and it's usually no one. It's not that I'm a bad person, but I don't cry, right? I mean, I don't shed tears about it. I didn't know the person. I love them, but I didn't have a strong emotional bond with this person. Other times it comes across and it is somebody I know, and I usually think about it, and I think about the times I was with them, and it hits me a little deeper. Oh, this person's passed away, but we don't have that strong emotional bond with everybody in this world. The command to love is not a command to feel emotional about people. It's not even a command to feel emotional about God. And we'll talk about that, but the emotion is something that develops over time, but really love is more about a decision. You've heard it translated this way, but love is defined, this word for love is defined as charity or goodwill towards man. It's about wanting good for others. It's about really respecting relationship and the relationship that you have with somebody. For example, it can mean different things for different people, right? Jesus said in John 14 and verse 15, if you love me, keep my commandments. So does that mean that in order to love somebody, I have to keep their commandments? No. I'm supposed to love the world, but I don't have to keep the commandments of everybody in the world. I agape love my children, but it doesn't mean that I keep their commandments, right? That's not what it's about, but for God it is. For Jesus it is. Right? I'm told to love my wife, and yet the way I love my wife is not the way I love my children, and it's not the way I love you. I'm told to love the people that are just out in the world. I'm told to love really people in the world. I'm told to love the stranger at Walmart, and yet I don't treat the stranger at Walmart the way I treat my children, and I don't treat my children the way I treat the stranger at Walmart. Right? And so though it means charity and goodwill towards man, it's not equal with each person. It's about respecting who the person is and the relationship that I should have with them. If I treat my wife like I treat the stranger at Walmart, I might love or say I love them both, but I'm not showing love to my wife like I should. Even though I'm commanded to love them both, it's not always going to appear to be the same thing. It's not always going to show itself in the same way. It's about wanting good for the other person. And if I treat my children like I treat a stranger, it's not good for them. If I treat my wife like I treat my children, it's not good for her. If I treat God the way I treat anybody else in this world, it's not good. It's about respecting who the person is and how it is that I should act with this person in order to do good for them. Okay, so that's what the command is. It's not a command to be emotional. Now, emotion develops. I mean, and sometimes it shows itself in emotion. We understand when we love sometimes, when we love people, sometimes usually that love develops or that emotion develops. All right, you're emotional about your spouse. You're emotional about your children. You're emotional about God. But that develops over time. Jesus isn't commanding that emotion. He's commanding the dedication. He's commanding the love. He's commanding to treat people the way you should treat them. And he's commanding to treat God and honor God the way you should treat and honor him. That's what he's commanding. And so point number 2 on your outline is this. We asked the question, who are you required to love? Well, Jesus just answered that question pretty clearly. The first and foremost is you love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. That's what the commandment is. That's who you're commanded to love. You're commanded to love God. And again, you don't love God like you love people. If I treat God the way I treat anybody else in this world, then I don't love him the way I ought to love him. In order to love God, then I serve God and I follow God. And this is all going to be very important when we start to understand what Jesus taught about this. That to love God does not mean that I can say I have an emotional bond with him. The truth is this, there's a lot of people who have an emotional bond with God in our world, but they don't really love him. Not the way that Jesus commanded anyway. They have great feelings towards him. They have strong emotion towards God. But that's not what Jesus was commanding. And that's going to be really important here in a moment. The other is that Jesus said, not only do you love God, but the second like it, you love your neighbor as yourself. Now, we kind of talked about that this morning with the idea that there's the obvious implication in there that we love self. All right, and we talked about that. But I want you to realize what he's saying here. Remember, love is to want good for somebody else or to desire the good in another. It's about charity and goodwill towards man. It's about doing good for other people. And he says what you ought to do is treat people in a sense the way you treat yourself. See, I take care of myself. When I'm cold, if I were freezing, I would go get myself a jacket. Or I would do something to warm my body if I could. If I was hungry or starving, I would go take care of my body. I'd go get a sandwich or something to feed and nourish myself, to take care of myself. It's about knowing my body needs something right now. And because I want good for it, I'm going to do what it needs in order to take care of my body. He says, you love your neighbor like yourself. If you're starving, you'll go get yourself food. What if your neighbor's starving? What will you do? If you're freezing to death, you'll go take care of yourself, or you'll do the best you can to take care of. Turn the heater up in the house. You'll put a jacket on, something to take care of yourself. Your neighbor's starving or freezing. What do? Maybe they don't have the means to feed themselves. You gonna let them starve to death? You wouldn't do that for yourself. What happens if they're freezing to death, and yet they don't have the means to pay for a heater? They don't have the means to get a jacket or clothing or something to warm themselves up. What are you going to do? You going to let them freeze? You wouldn't do that for yourself. If you could help yourself, you would help yourself. That's what it is to love self. Well, to love others doesn't necessarily mean you have this strong emotional bond towards them. It means you help them. It might be that you have an emotional bond towards them, but if you're not willing to help them, then what good is that emotional bond that you have? It's very similar to what James taught in James chapter 2. He says, your brother is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you walks by and says, be warmed and filled, but doesn't give them the things that are needed. What good is it, right? I mean, if you really love somebody, you're going to help them when you can help them if they need help. It doesn't mean you give people everything they want. I mean, I don't give myself everything I want. But a person's starving. A person's freezing. A person lacks the basic necessities of life and the things that they need. And you just are unconcerned about it? That's not love. And so what Jesus is saying, that the command is to do it's about doing, right? It's not just about emotion. It's about doing. It's about helping. It's serving God. How do you love God? Well, you do the things he tells you to do. How do you help man? You see them hungry. You see them freeze, and you do something for them. You love them like you would love yourself. It's not a deep emotional bond. It's doing something. It's caring for people and being willing to help people in their need. All right, that's what it's about. And so Jesus would go on to say, in point number 3 on your outline, that these two commands, and it should have been plural, I understand, hold all the other commands up. Right? These two commands hold the other ones up. And what he says in verse 40 is on these two commands hang all the law and the prophets. All right, so these commands are the ones that everything else is hanging and hinging upon. You take, it's like you're hanging a picture. In loving God and loving your neighbor is the nail that you're hanging that picture with. And you pull that nail out, and guess what happens? Everything else falls apart. It's kind of like what Paul was talking about with those miraculous gifts he had there in the beginning of 1 Corinthians chapter 13. I can do all these things, but if I don't have love, I'm a sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. I can do all these things, but if I don't have love, then it profits me nothing. It's pointless. Well, if you don't have love, then the other commands have nothing to stand upon. Really, if you have a proper understanding of what this love is, then all the other commands are going to be held up. If it's an emotional bond, then this isn't necessarily true. But if you understand what it's about, then it's certainly true. If I love God with all my heart and soul and mind, if I love God with my all, and that's about more than just an emotional bond, but it's about respecting him as God. It's about obedience to him and realizing who he is, right? If I treat my wife the way I treat my child, then it's not real love for her. If I treat my children like I treat a stranger, then it's not real love for him. And if I treat God like I treat anybody else, then it's not real love for God. I have to hold God in a place like nobody else. If he's ever number 2 on the list, then he's not where he needs to be, and I don't love him the way I ought to love him. So to love God the way I'm commanded to love God means I hold him in his proper place. In his proper place is a place of authority, is my creator, is my master. If I don't hold him in that place, then I'm not giving him the place in my life he deserves. And so God says, old law, should not commit adultery. God says, you shall have no other gods before me. God says, you shall not bear false witness. And you can go through any of the other laws, and if I say, not doing them, then I'm not giving God the place he deserves. I don't love him like I should. I might have an emotional bond in a sense, but I don't love him the way Jesus commanded me to love him. Love your neighbor as yourself. I might feel bad when someone's cold, but if I don't do anything for him, then I don't love him the way I should. And so you think of any command within the Bible that God has given, and if you love God the way you should, and you love your neighbor the way you should, you're going to obey those commands. All the other commands hang upon them. You take the law, you take the prophets, and Jesus is speaking at a time before the New Testament, and certainly it would be true in the New Testament as well, but he's talking about the law of Moses. He's talking about the prophets and the things that the prophets wrote. You read throughout that Old Testament, and there's not a command in there that you'll just slough off and throw out the window if you really love God. Because if you love God, you'll keep him. And if you don't have that love, then you won't. It's like pulling the nail out and all the pictures fall. You pull that love out and all the other commands just fall to the ground. It's the love that keeps you living the way you want to live. That's what love is. Wonderful passage of the Bible. And I don't know what those Pharisees thought when they came trying to test Jesus. What's the greatest command? Thinking maybe, well, if he gives me one command, that means we don't have to do the others. And what Jesus just said is, no, here's the command. And if you obey that command, you'll keep all the others. I love the interactions with Jesus. I mean, he was obviously an understatement, brilliant. I mean, no one like him who just always knew the answer. He just always knew what was right. And so many times they tested him and they tried him and they wanted to catch him in a fault. They wanted to make him stumble over his word. They wanted to get him. And he always had the answer. And this time the answer is this. You love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And you love your neighbor as yourself. And if you can do those, then you'll be pleasing to God. The question tonight is this: do you? Do you love God the way you should? If you love God the way you should, then you'll do the things that he's told you to do. You'll obey the commands that he's commanded you. You'll live a life that is pleasing and glorifying to him. There might be some in here who have been living in their sins, and they need to have those sins washed away. And they want to live with God, and if that's true, then you'll do what God has told you to do to have those sins washed away. There might be some in here who have at one point had those sins washed away, yet they step back into the world and haven't been living for God. And what's happened is they've stopped loving him the way they should. It might still be that you're emotional about him, but you don't have the love that Jesus commanded you to have for him, the decision and the dedication to love him. If we can help you this evening get your life right with God, show the love for God that you need to show, that Jesus is commanding, we want to help you do that. If we can study with you or in any way help you get your life right with God, why don't you please sit on one of the front rows while we stand and sing the song of invitation.